Hi everybody and welcome to the channel. This is Old Man Computer and my name is Don. The reason I've created this channel is basically to take you through the journey of a real first-timer, someone who's never looked or worked inside of a computer before, through the process of building my first computer. This right here, that's it. Basically, I filmed a lot of video building it. Unfortunately, my camera died halfway through, so the quality's just really not good enough. There's going to be some B-roll and whatnot that you're going to be able to see, but largely it's going to be me talking about a few other things instead of focusing on the build, because quite frankly, there's a lot of build videos out there done by some really great YouTubers. I'll put some links in the description below that take you through all the things you need to know about the build process and the different parts that you're going to need and stuff. The purpose for my video is a little bit different. See, as a first timer, without any practice runs or anything like that, it was really about dealing with my anxiety. So buying a computer pre-made is less difficult, really, than buying all the parts you're going to need to build your own. Even though the parts, when you buy your parts separately, you're actually going to end up with a higher spec computer because you're not paying for people to put it together and you're not paying for people to test it because you're doing all those things yourself. So that's a few $100s built into the price of every pre-built computer that you'll ever buy that you don't have to pay when you're building your own system. Problem is, you're going to run into some difficulties along the way. Things are never as easy as you'd like to think they are, and I ran into those problems as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the process of picking the parts, how I came up with that, what I built my computer for, because depending on who you are and what you want to do with it, your specifications are going to be different. Someone who just wants to game, for example, is going to be very different from someone who wants to stream or do video or audio production and stuff like that. And I really just wanted to learn how to do all of these things. And so I built a computer that, while it's sort of medium grade in terms of its specifications, it's right in the middle there. It can do all of those things okay. Can't do them great. It's by no means a beast, but it is a capable machine for gaming, for video encoding, for audio, and for basically, hopefully anyway, streaming at some point. I'd like to give that a shot because I love video games, and I think that it'd be fun to share some of that with you out on the internet. So with that being said, I really want to focus a little bit on the people who I'm hoping to reach, because ultimately, if you already know about computers, or you've already built your first computer and stuff like that, hopefully there's something here for you. I really do hope that you find this entertaining and potentially interesting or informative or something like that. But at the very least, I don't want it to be a waste of time for anyone who watches this. But I'm primarily speaking to people who are like parents. So if you've got a kid who wants to get into gaming, a boy or girl who's interested in YouTube or vlogging or music production or podcasting or something like that, and they want to create sort of they want to learn how to do all these things. So the reason I think building your own computer instead of buying a pre-built one, even though pre-builds are fine, like I said, they're a little bit more expensive, but generally speaking, they're not a bad product at all. One of the reasons I think building a computer is really good for this type of thing, when you want to get into this, is because it teaches you how to deal with the technology. So you build the system. It's like putting together adult Lego. You troubleshoot it, you learn about the pieces that go into it, the technology that makes it work, the software, and you get more confident in how to troubleshoot things as you go. And that confidence is going to play into, or at least build, your capacity to do more with it. You're not going to be afraid of taking the next step, fiddling around with settings on an audio software or video encoder or something like that. Because frankly, once you've done the setup of a machine, you can handle it. And it's just learning the steps. Yes, it's not going to be perfect the first time. Nothing ever is. That's okay. But you can really learn a lot through this process. And so that's why I'm here. I mean, I'm learning a lot here too. I have never done any of this before. This is the first computer build that I've ever done. This is the first time I've had to install Windows on a fresh machine, set up the BIOS, get everything running, videotape myself. I mean, I'm still weirded out a little bit talking to a camera, but whatever. And then encoding that and making sure that the audio matches up and the quality is good enough to put it out there without being embarrassed about it. And so it's really sort of a learning process for me too. And hopefully I won't make too many mistakes along the way. But if I do, feel free to point them out in the comments below, or alternatively, subscribe and like if you find that this is really interesting. This is really interesting, or you'd like to see more. So without too much further ado, I think it's time to get into the nuts and bolts of this. So let's get to it. Before I get going on this, I should probably say I'm bound to miss some things along the way here, just because I am new at this and I'm not going to be sort of covering everything. So if I do, and it's something that you think is pretty important, just leave it in the comments below, because I think that that's really important, the community discussion, and especially the advice that you can give to other people. So what you spend should always depend on what you plan on using your computer for, whether it's gaming or video or sound production, office work, or if you're a student and you just need to write term papers and that type of thing, or presentations, or if you're into graphic design or animation, or you just need, something to surf the internet and watch YouTube videos on. You don't need the same level of hardware to do each of these things, which means you don't need to spend as much money as you might think. For example, if you're a student and you're not really into techie stuff, you might be better served spending some extra money on software instead of hardware. You don't need an amazing video card if all you're going to do is presentations and term papers. You can build a decent computer for a few $100s and then use what's left over for things like Microsoft Office or Adobe Premiere. Although, to be fair, if you're going to be using Adobe Premiere, you probably want a beefier setup. So what I did is I tried to build a computer that can do all of these things okay. Not great. It's not the best machine on the planet by any means, because I didn't want to spend thousands and thousands of dollars, but it's definitely capable of basically all of those things I talked about, as long as I'm focusing on being a hobbyist instead of a professional. How do we go from this to this to this? Every PC needs at least 6 of the parts I'm going to list below. CPU, that's the brain of the computer, which could have integrated graphics or it might not. Motherboard, RAM, hard drive, power supply, case. As well as that, you may want a video card, cooling, so for example extra fans, or if your CPU doesn't come with a cooler, then obviously something for that, a monitor so that you can see what's going on inside, keyboard and mouse, speakers or headphones, and in addition to that, if you want to do some other things, a camera, microphone, a mouse pad's always good, desk, chair, LEDs if you like RGB lighting, so you can make your computer nice and fancy, and all sorts of other little add-ons. So my advice is to do a little research, watch some other YouTubers talk about what they recommend, or read some articles on the internet from tech-focused websites. The more you know, the better your experience is going to be. Parts should be recent, launched within the last year or two because of availability, compatibility, and ongoing support. You buy something old that's on an old platform or something like that, and your ability to buy replacement parts when it comes time to, or upgrade, it's going to be pretty limited because that stuff is just not current anymore. You will also have to choose between Intel and AMD for the CPU and motherboard combination.
and AMD or NVIDIA if you want a graphics card. There are different reasons for choosing any of these brands, but generally speaking, when it comes to processors, Intel is more expensive and, until recently anyway, has always had better and faster processors. Their speeds are just higher, and they benchmark a little bit better when people review them. They get a little bit more performance. However, AMD's newest Zen 2 CPUs have changed that. But even the previous generation of Zen Plus CPUs are worth a look. So these are Ryzen 2000 series, basically. So Ryzen 2200s, 2400s, 26, 26X, 27, 27X, that type of thing. Or 2700, 2700X, I should say. Sorry. They are probably 10 to 15% slower, maybe a little bit more. But ultimately, they'll be much cheaper now that the new generation is out. So you'll get a discount that makes up for that performance deficit, I think, anyway. AMD CPUs are also overclockable on pretty much all platforms, whereas Intel processors are not, unless you buy their premium brands. They have a pricing scheme where if you buy a regular processor from them for a regular amount of money, you're just going to get a regular experience. Everything's locked. But if you buy a premium X series processor, then you'll end up with an overclockable machine that you can push a little bit of extra performance out of. Those X brand processors, though, get very expensive very quickly. Graphics cards are the same situation. NVIDIA is a tad more powerful and more power efficient in most cases, but AMD has good cards that are close to their performance and generally more affordable. And this kind of changes now and again. AMD recently launched their 5700 and 5700X series Radeon GPUs, and their performance is actually quite good compared to NVIDIA's stuff. And that's actually sort of like the first time in quite some years where they've managed to measure up in that way, especially at the price points they're picking. So they're aggressive in their price points and performance, or price to performance ratio, basically. They're better there in many cases than NVIDIA is, because NVIDIA, being the better brand in terms of performance, gets to charge a premium the same way Intel does, although that may be changing slowly. For a gaming-focused computer, a 4-core CPU is likely good enough, although if you want a little extra headroom, 6 cores will help in multitasking and newer high-end gaming. It also gives you better capacity to stream or record gameplay, and it also helps out in workloads. So if you want to do video editing or something like that, a few extra cores actually go a long way in making things go faster, basically. Whichever brand you pick, check the socket and compatible motherboards for that socket. Usually there's a list of choices available. So for example, AMD's AM4 socket there's an A320 platform that I don't think anybody really talks about anymore. B350, again, out of date. B450 is still current. X470 and X570 motherboards are all compatible. And these are chipsets that go on the motherboard with a AM4 socket that a AMD Ryzen CPU can plug into, whether it's Ryzen the first generation, the second or third iteration. So Zen, Zen Plus, and Zen 2. It's a little bit confusing because ultimately the way they've branded these things is a little bit confusing. But basically, if you look at their product stack, if you take a look at the AMD breakdown of all the different processors, the Zen processors they've put out on Wikipedia, for example, you'll see how that works. The rest of the computer is basically interchangeable because the rest of the parts are essentially going to work with either AMD, Intel, or NVIDIA and AMD. It doesn't really matter there. I mentioned something about power efficiency, and I think it's important to note that it doesn't really make that much of a difference when it comes to video cards. We're talking about $5 a year or less in terms of operating costs. So that's really not, like, power consumption on a graphics card, whether it's 180 watts or 220 watts or whatever it is, that's not really going to be a driving factor. It shouldn't be a driving factor pretty much anywhere. Just make sure that you get a decent power supply. So if you are running a CPU, motherboard, video card combination that's drawing something like 300 watts, you want a power supply at least 500, I would say, 500 watts for headroom, and also to take into account any spikes that happen when everything sort of ticks up. So having a power supply that can handle that. And also the other thing too is that the efficiency rating of the power supply. So if it's 80 plus or 80 plus bronze, silver, gold, or platinum, that will tell you, whether you're going to be like 80 to 90% efficient on the energy it's using. But most of that is at less than 80% draw usually. So you're going to get better performance out of the power supply, better efficiency at the power supply, the more headroom you have between what your system's actually drawing and what its maximum output is. If you're at 100%, number one, you're probably going to end up into some sort of a throttling situation. But number two, your power supply isn't going to be as efficient as if you were drawing less, like 60 or 70% of the available power. And power supplies, they don't draw maximum load all the time. They draw what the computer needs. So if you've got a 600 watt power supply and your computer only needs 300, it's just going to draw 300. So I've done a few builds on PC Part Picker at different price points, just as a interesting mental exercise basically, but also because I did so many builds before I tackled this. So feel free to check them out. The links are in the description below. I will say this, the PC Part Picker is a great tool to give you an idea of the cost and compatibility and availability of your parts, and it will actually give you a sort of rundown on the power consumption as well. Now, it's not definitive on that. You're going to want to check the specifications as well, just to make sure that you're not running into limits, but basically it's pretty accurate, and as long as you get a power supply that's over and above what the site says you're expected to draw, you should be okay. As long as you've got a couple extra 100 watts there, I don't think there's going to be any issue. So one thing I will say though is that the website is also not definitive. I actually found better deals than what I saw on that site, but it's a good place to start, and then if you shop around afterwards, you'll have a good result. So my build, I went with AMD, both for the CPU and the video card. The reason I did that is because I just got good deals. AMD just launched their third iteration of Ryzen, which is the Ryzen 2. As I said before, that's confusing. It bothers me too because the branding is just kind of not great. But with regard to AMD, their older CPUs are now discounted as they get rid of inventory, and discounts mean deals, and that's why I went with what I went with. So for my CPU, I picked a Ryzen 2600 6-core 12-thread processor. The reason I did that was because it has headroom for gaming and productivity. It was on sale, and the price point was in the right range. I was about like 165 Canadian. For motherboard, I went with an MSI Carbon AC B450 motherboard. The reason I did that was because it had Wi-Fi, which was super important given where the computer is located. I don't have the option to run a cable. So if I didn't buy that motherboard, I would still need to buy a $30 to $40 adapter or Wi-Fi card if it wasn't included. So I priced it in just to make sure that I had a little extra budget for that part. For RAM, I went with 16 gigabytes of 3200 megahertz G-Skill Ripjaws RAM with a cache latency of 16. I went with this because it was the cheapest 3200 kit in the store. For the video card, I went with a Gigabyte RX 590 8 gigabyte video card. It's AMD. The RX 590 is an AMD brand. And the reason I went with that was because it was price matched for $100 off its regular cost. I went with a Samsung 960 500 gigabyte SSD, so a solid state drive, because it was on sale. And I filled out my storage with a Seagate Barracuda 2 terabyte hard drive, 7200 RPM hard drive, and that was also on sale when I picked it up. Power supply was a Deepcool 600 watt 80 plus bronze. For the monitor, I went with an AOC 22 inch 75 hertz FreeSync monitor. It was on sale. It is only 1080p, but with the FreeSync helping smooth out gameplay and the AMD card being more geared towards 1080p HD resolution, basically, I thought that was probably a better buy. And the next resolution up, the 1440p monitors, were probably twice as expensive at the time. Mouse and keyboard, I went with a Logitech MK850 wireless mouse and keyboard combination. It was more expensive than I wanted to go at about $129, but I have it at work and I love the ergonomics of it, and it's just super comfortable. I type a lot, so I wasn't willing to compromise on that. And it was just a personal choice. But you can always go a lot cheaper. There's keyboards and mice that work perfectly well in the $20 to $50 range, absolutely. For gaming, that only matters in competitive or multiplayer settings, so you don't really need to worry too much about that if you're just running around in a single player title, RPG, open world shooter, something like that. If you're just doing it for fun, you don't need anything special. Case was a Cougar MX330G ATX mid-tower case. Reason I got that was because it was well reviewed and cheap. Let's face it, it was $60. It was not expensive. Speakers are Edifier somethings. They were like $40, nothing major. When I added up all the costs before taxes, it was about $1,150 Canadian, or roughly $875 US. My budget was about $1,200 Canadian, so not too bad. It was a little bit under. However, my build could have easily been an Intel or NVIDIA build. Really, for me, what mattered most is the discounts. If AMD's parts hadn't been as cheap as they were, I probably would have gone with NVIDIA for some of the other things. If I had chosen a cheaper mouse, keyboard, motherboard, and potentially a CPU, or gotten rid of the SSD or chosen a cheaper SSD, I probably could have gotten a better video card. But the price to performance situation wouldn't have been quite as good. And that's really what I was using to guide myself. I wasn't really willing to spend 30% more for maybe 10 to 15% performance. And I know that the RX 590 is not necessarily the best mid-range graphics card, but it's okay. And it works well enough. And that's really what I wanted. And for the price that I paid for it, it's cost per frame. And that's really what a lot of reviewers use to determine sort of the price point that they're thinking is good for a video card. That was quite lovely, because when I picked it up, it was about equal to an RX 570, which is a couple of steps down the road in terms of cost. That's how good of a deal it was. Now, because I picked up these parts with the motherboard and with the power supply, I actually have a good upgrade path, so I can pop in a new updated Ryzen CPU in a few years and a better video card as well, and everything will still work. That was super important to me as well, the ability to expand later once I decide to spend a little bit extra money, and hopefully I'll be able to sell the old parts because they should still work at that point, so that's always a good thing. Everything but the CPU I bought from a local computer store. Actually, Canada Computers has a location near me, so shout out to them for helping me out. The CPU I got from Amazon because it was on a steep discount. So I think it was Amazon prices are always a little bit funky, but it said it was roughly speaking $100 off its normal price. I think it's more like $20 off its new price, but it was still a pretty good deal. I insured the CPU, motherboard, and power supply, which is probably a waste of money, but it gave me peace of mind for about $30 or $40. So not strictly speaking a bad investment, just for the sake of feeling good about things. For computer parts, I do recommend going into a store if you can. I got advice from a pretty good staff person and the chance to see everything up close so I could compare pieces. If it was important to me, I could look at color schemes and stuff like that. They also updated the motherboard to ensure that it was compatible with new processors. And stores generally offer easier returns, although they may be more time limited than something like Amazon. Online means mailing the part back, and that can suck. There are hidden costs in shipping, and having to find a box or arrange that is an annoyance. So in terms of the build, again, because there are so many good build videos out there, I don't want to go over that so much. So if you're looking for instructions on how to build a computer from start to finish, I would suggest checking out, again, the Linus Tech Tips, Jay's 2 Cents, Paul's Hardware, Gamers Nexus. There's so many good options out there that you could look at, and really they're all quite straightforward and fairly friendly to beginners, because again, they're trying to show that this is something that can be done by anybody. I will say, though, that I learned a few lessons along the way, And those I do want to share. So the first thing is install your CPU, RAM, and cooler before you install your motherboard in your case. The first thing that I did was CPU, RAM, and cooler on the motherboard before anything else. After that, because I had to put those things into the computer case, I made sure to install my input-output shield, so the piece that goes on the back of the motherboard that protects all the different slots and plugins on the back of the computer. I put that in first before putting the motherboard in. The other thing that I actually forgot to do, and I recommend you do as well, is when you do the spacing of everything, check your video card and see where it lines up with the PCI covers. Before you put the motherboard in, make sure you pull off the ones that need to come off. Because I forgot one, I thought that my video card would fit in one slot or two slots, but I picked the wrong one, because it was actually a little bit lower than I expected, and ended up having to pull everything out so that I could bend that piece of metal out of the way. And it was that, or it was risk damaging a component, and I didn't want to wreck the motherboard by being rough with the case metal. So it took a little bit of extra time, and it was annoying. But again, it's better than damaging a component. Lastly, I will say that case management is important and not generally pretty the first time you do it. The front side of the computer will be pretty. The back side will kind of be a little bit ugly. Zip ties are a lifesaver because they keep all the different cable chunks organized and out of the way. The other thing that I will say is that my Cougar case came with a short audio cable. So on the front of the computer, there are usually USB plugins and like a headphone jack and a power switch and stuff like that. And the cable for the headphone jack wasn't long enough to reach the header on the motherboard, so the place where you plug that in, where it sits at the back of the case. So I actually had to reroute it to make it reach, and the motherboard, I don't think, it may have, but I don't think it came with an extender cable. So you might have to buy one if your case is a little bit too roomy and the cable they included isn't long enough, because you don't want it to be like going over the graphics card or anything like that, or interfering with any of the other components. And that's really it. Other than that, everything went okay. Everything was easy to screw in and install, basically. I managed to get it to post, so when I started it up for the first time, it worked. It booted into BIOS. From there, I just had to install Windows. So yeah, it was actually surprisingly straightforward. I'm not going to say easy because I was sweating a little bit during the time and it took me a few hours to get everything right, but by and large, not impossible and definitely not as challenging as I thought it would be. In terms of performance, my computer is about where I expected it on what the reviews told me. The CPU and video card are also running at stock speeds for now, so there's likely some room for improvement in performance by overclocking or something like that, but I'm not yet at that point. I'm not yet ready to cross that bridge, so to speak. So I think that's probably enough to talk about right now. So I hope you found this helpful. I definitely learned a lot in the process, and I'm no longer intimidated by the idea of building a new computer. That's really what I was hoping for. One thing I will say though about the case is that it's loud. It's an air cooling focused case. So it's got a mesh front, and that mesh front does not do too much to dampen sound. So I might experiment with water cooling next time by doing something like an all-in-one CPU cooler or something like that, because I think the CPU cooler is probably the loudest fan in the system I have. Again, thanks for being here. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Like, subscribe if you did, dislike if you didn't, and I will see you all next time.